I've been feeding the same Bigfoot for 33 years, and the truth about what happened to him, why they found only my left arm that cold November morning, is a secret I've carried to my grave. My name was James Whitaker. I was a wildlife biologist stationed at the Olympic National Forest Research Center in Washington State. What began as a standard black bear population study in 1989 ended in blood and revelation 3 decades later. This is my story, found in the pages of my journal, the only evidence that remains of what really happened in those ancient mountains. The Olympic Peninsula in early spring wears a perpetual shroud of mist, as if the mountains themselves are breathing. I arrived at the remote research station on March 17, 1989, eager to begin my first major field study after completing my doctorate at the University of Washington. The station, little more than a weathered cabin with solar panels and a small generator, sat in a clearing surrounded by towering Douglas firs and western hemlocks. My supervisor, Dr. Eleanor Richards, had warned me about the isolation. "The nearest town is 43 miles away, James," she'd said, her eyes serious over her coffee cup. "Radio reception is spotty, cell phones don't work up there. You'll be checking in once a week, and if we don't hear from you, we'll send someone. But otherwise, you're on your own." I nodded confidently. I'd grown up in rural Montana. Isolation didn't frighten me. What I couldn't have known was that I was never truly alone in those woods. The first signs came 3 weeks into my stay. I'd set up 12 camera traps along game trails, baited with salmon and honey to attract the bears I was studying. When I checked the cameras on April 9th, I found 3 destroyed, not damaged but crushed, as if something had deliberately smashed them against rocks. The memory cards were missing. The tracks I found nearby didn't match any North American predator I recognized. They measured 18.7 inches long and 8.2 inches at the widest part, with 5 distinct toe impressions. The stride length between prints averaged 5.3 feet. Whatever made them would stand at least 8 feet tall based on my calculations. "You're looking at an elk with overlapping tracks," Dr. Richards said dismissively when I radioed in my findings. The rain probably distorted them. But it hadn't rained for 4 days, and I knew what I was seeing. A week later, I felt it for the first time, the sensation of being watched. I was collecting scat samples near a creek when the forest went silent. No bird song, no insects buzzing, no squirrels chattering, just the soft gurgle of water over stones and my own breathing, suddenly too loud in my ears. I turned slowly, scanning the tree line. That's when I saw it. A shadow darker than the others, massive and unmoving, partially hidden between 2 ancient cedars. As my eyes adjusted, I could make out broad shoulders, a large head with a pronounced sagittal crest, and dark, intelligent eyes reflecting the dappled sunlight. We stared at each other for 17 seconds. I counted them in my thundering heartbeat before it stepped back and melted into the forest with impossible silence for something so large. That evening, my hands still shaking, I called the one person who might believe me. Joseph Two Rivers, a Quinault elder who'd helped establish the research station's location years earlier. He arrived the next day, his weathered face grave as I showed him the plaster casts I'd made of the prints. Joseph ran his fingers over the impressions, nodding slowly. "My grandfather called them Se'ak," he said quietly, "the tall ones who walk between worlds. They've lived in these mountains since before our people came." "You believe they exist?" I asked, surprised at his matter-of-fact tone. Joseph looked at me with ancient eyes. "Believing implies doubt, Dr. Whitaker. I know they exist. The question is why this one wanted you to see it." He wouldn't elaborate further, but before leaving, He placed a small carved stone figure on my desk, humanoid but massive, with deep-set eyes. Leave food as an offering. Never follow it without invitation. And understand that seeing them changes you. You become part of their world, for better or worse. I dismissed his warnings as cultural mythology, but something made me keep the carving. 2 nights later, I left a salmon on a flat rock near where I'd seen the creature. By morning, it was gone, replaced with a perfectly symmetrical pine cone that wasn't native to this part of the forest. For weeks, this exchange continued. Food left, items returned. I documented everything meticulously, hiding my findings from my weekly reports to Dr. Richards. Science wasn't ready for what I was discovering, or perhaps I wasn't ready for my discoveries to be dismissed as delusion. On May 23rd, exactly 53 days after my arrival, I saw it clearly for the first time. I was photographing bear markings on a tree when a low, rumbling vocalization cut through the morning fog. I turned, camera still raised, and there it stood at the edge of a clearing, 8 feet tall, covered in dark brown hair with silver streaks through its massive shoulders and back. Its face was both ape-like and disturbingly human, with deep-set eyes that held an intelligence I couldn't deny. I took 3 photographs before my rational mind caught up with my finger on the shutter. By the 4th press, it was gone. That night, I examined the images by lamplight. 2 showed only blurred movement. The 3rd captured what would define the next 33 years of my life. A face looking back at me with unmistakable curiosity, recognition, and something else I couldn't yet identify. Fear? Warning? Invitation? I didn't know then that it was all 3. The summer of 1989 stretched into autumn, and with each passing week my unusual relationship with the creature I'd begun calling Silverback, for the distinctive gray patches in his fur developed its own rhythm. I established a routine, leaving food offerings every 3rd day at the same flat rock. Fresh salmon when I could catch it, dried fruit, nuts, occasionally even sandwiches from my own meals. At first, I'd leave the food and retreat to my cabin, but gradually I began to linger, sitting on a fallen log 50 yards away, waiting. By October, Silverback would appear while I was still there, though he kept his distance. He moved with surprising grace for his size, approaching the rock cautiously, dark eyes always watching me. I remained still, maintaining what I believed was a respectful distance. Sometimes he would make a low, rumbling vocalization, not threatening, but acknowledging my presence. I started speaking to him in soft tones, simple words and phrases, not expecting understanding but hoping my voice would become familiar, unthreatening. The first major breakthrough came on December 12, 1989. Snow had fallen the previous night, blanketing the forest in 9 inches of pristine white. I trudged through the drifts to leave a bag of dried apples and jerky, my breath clouding in the 28-degree air. Instead of retreating, I sat on my log, wrapped in thermal gear. Minutes passed. Then, through the silence of the snow-covered forest, came the now familiar sound of heavy footfalls, deliberately placed. Silverback emerged from between 2 snow-laden hemlocks, but this time he didn't stop at the rock. He continued forward, each massive step leaving impressions in the snow that measured nearly 2 feet long. He stopped just 15 feet from where I sat, close enough that I could see the steam of his breath, count the silver strands in his dark fur, observe the remarkable dexterity in his massive, 5-fingered hands. Slowly, deliberately, I reached into my pack and withdrew another apple. Without standing, any sudden movement might break this fragile moment. I extended my arm, offering it directly. For 37 heartbeats, we remained frozen in this tableau. Then Silverback closed the distance between us. His movement was cautious but not fearful. He reached out, fingers remarkably similar to my own but twice the size, and took the apple from my hand without touching my skin. That evening, I radioed Dr. Hugh Richards with a carefully edited report on black bear hibernation patterns, omitting any mention of my encounter. Her voice crackled through the static. "James, your data collection has been inconsistent. These numbers don't track with historical patterns." "The weather's been unusual," I lied, watching through the window as Silverback's silhouette appeared at the forest edge, observing my cabin from a distance. "We're sending Peterson up next week to check your equipment," she replied. "Make sure everything's in working order." After the call, I sat in the dim light of my kerosene lamp, making detailed entries in a journal I kept separate from my official research notes. The risk of discovery was increasing, but I couldn't stop now. Something unprecedented was happening in these mountains, and I was at the center of it. By spring 1990, Silverback had begun leaving his own offerings. Interesting rocks with quartz veins running through them, unusual pine cones, once a perfectly intact bird's nest containing 3 small blue eggs. I cataloged each item, photographing them against graph paper for scale. These weren't random objects, they were selected, carried, and deliberately placed, evidence of communication, of reciprocity, of relationship. In June 1991, during a heavy thunderstorm, I was mapping a newly discovered bear den when the ground beneath me gave way. A sinkhole opened by the torrential rain. I fell 12 feet, landing hard, my ankle twisting beneath me with an audible snap. Pain shot up my leg as rainwater began pooling around me. My radio was in my backpack, still at the edge of the collapsed ground above. Night was falling, the temperature dropping with it. I called out, knowing no human would hear me, but someone did. Within 30 minutes, Silverback appeared at the edge of the sinkhole, looking down at me with what I could only interpret as concern. He vocalized softly, then disappeared. I feared he'd abandoned me, but 15 minutes later, he returned with a long, sturdy branch, which he lowered into the hole. When I grabbed it, he pulled with controlled strength, lifting me out as easily as I might lift a child. As I sat catching my breath, Silverback did something remarkable. He touched my swollen ankle gently, then disappeared again, returning with a handful of chewed plant matter, which he placed beside me. The paste smelled of wintergreen and something bitter. Following his gestures, I applied it to my ankle. The natural salve numbed the pain enough for me to hobble back to my cabin. By 1994, I had mapped Silverback's territory, approximately 17 square miles, centered around a series of caves in the most remote section of the mountains. He seemed to patrol the boundaries regularly, and I discovered he used specific trees as markers, leaving deep claw marks at precise intervals, always 7 feet up the trunk. I began to understand when certain areas were off-limits. He would appear suddenly on the path ahead, making short, sharp sounds and blocking my way if I approached sensitive locations. One morning in September 1996, I found a strange marking scratched into the soil near our meeting place. A rough circle with lines radiating outward like a simple sun. Beside it lay a tuft of fur, darker and redder than Silverback's. He wasn't alone in these mountains, and somehow he wanted me to know it. The autumn of 1996 painted the Olympic Mountains in shades of amber and crimson. I had been stationed at the research cabin for 7 years, my official black bear study long since completed, but I'd secured continued funding through increasingly creative grant proposals. Dr. Richards had grown suspicious of my extended stay, but couldn't argue with the volume of data I provided, even if much of it was carefully curated to hide my true focus. On a crisp October morning, with frost crunching beneath my boots, I arrived at the usual meeting place to find Silverback waiting. Unusual for him to be there first. He stood tall, nearly 9 feet in his full height, dark eyes watching me with an intensity I hadn't seen before. He made a series of short, rhythmic vocalizations, different from our usual exchanges, then turned and began walking deeper into the forest. He paused, looked back, and repeated the sound. The message was clear: follow me. We walked for nearly 3 miles, moving into a section of the range I'd rarely explored. The forest grew denser, the trees more ancient, their massive trunks draped with hanging moss that muffled our footsteps. Finally, we reached a small valley nestled between steep ridges, hidden from above by a canopy so thick that sunlight filtered through in narrow, dusty beams. Silverback stopped at the edge of a clearing and made a low, rumbling call. The sound echoed off the rocky walls of the valley. For a moment, nothing happened. Then, from the shadows beyond the clearing, movement caught my eye. A smaller figure emerged, 7 feet tall, covered in reddish-brown fur. A female, her movements more fluid than Silverback's, her build more slender but no less powerful. My heart hammered against my ribs as she approached, stopping at Silverback's side. He made a gentle sound, touching her arm in a gesture unmistakably affectionate. Behind her, 2 more figures appeared. Another male, darker than Silverback with no gray in his fur, and beside him, the most surprising sight of all. A juvenile, no more than 5 feet tall with lighter, almost golden brown fur. A family, a small clan. I was seeing what no other researcher had documented. A social group of Bigfoot in their natural habitat. I remained still, barely breathing, as the 4 creatures regarded me. The younger male showed signs of tension, his shoulders hunched, but Silverback made a sound that seemed to reassure him. The juvenile, however, displayed open curiosity, taking a half-step forward before the female gently pulled it back. Over the following months, Silverback gradually allowed me closer to his family group. I observed them from carefully negotiated distances, taking notes on their social interactions. They communicated through a complex system of vocalizations, facial expressions, and hand gestures. They used crude but effective tools: stones for cracking nuts, sharpened sticks for digging roots, woven branches for gathering berries. Their shelter, which I was eventually shown, consisted of a series of caves connected by tunnels, enhanced with constructed windbreaks made of interwoven branches and moss. Inside, they maintained separate sleeping areas lined with dried grass and ferns. I noted how they kept these spaces meticulously clean and organized, with specific places for food storage and tool keeping. By 2001, I had accumulated enough data to write several groundbreaking papers, work that would never see publication. The more I learned about these creatures, the more protective I became of their secret existence. My research had shown me their intelligence, their complex social bonds, their right to live undisturbed by a world that would either exploit or destroy them. That spring brought new concerns. Logging operations had been approved just 11 miles from the valley. The distant sound of chainsaws and heavy equipment sent the Bigfoot family into periods of agitation. Silverback would disappear for days, returning with heightened vigilance. The juvenile, now nearly adult size but still displaying youthful behavior, grew particularly distressed at the mechanical intrusions. I began using my position to subtly redirect human activity away from their territory. I falsified data about bear movements to have hiking trails rerouted. I reported non-existent erosion concerns to delay the logging operation. I became, in effect, their human guardian, a role I never anticipated but couldn't abandon. In July 2003, I discovered something disturbing. A motion sensor camera hidden near one of the game trails leading toward the valley. It wasn't mine, and it wasn't standard Forest Service equipment. Someone else was looking for something in these woods. When I checked my official messages that week, there was a new directive. The Department of Interior was conducting a special wildlife census in my research area, and I was to provide access to a team arriving the following month. That night, I hiked to Silverback's territory and found him already agitated, pacing at the forest edge. I didn't need our primitive communication system to convey my warning. He sensed the threat approaching. But what happened next changed everything I thought I knew about these creatures. Silverback led me to a section of the cave I'd never seen before, a chamber deeper than the others, illuminated only by the dim flashlight I carried. There, etched into the stone wall, were dozens of crude but recognizable pictographs, images of tall, fur-covered figures fleeing from smaller ones carrying straight objects that could only be weapons. The drawings weren't recent. Some were partially covered by mineral deposits suggesting they were decades, perhaps centuries old. This wasn't just a family. It was the remnant of a people with history, with memory, with trauma passed down through generations. And somewhere in their past, they had learned to fear humans, a lesson Silverback was trying to convey to me as the outside world closed in around us. The years from 2005 to 2013 brought changes to the Olympic National Forest that made my work of protecting Silverback's family increasingly difficult. Black government SUVs with tinted windows began appearing on the forest access roads. Unmarked helicopters swept low over the canopy, their rhythmic thumping sending the creatures into hiding for days afterward. The Special Wildlife Census team arrived. 4 men with military posture carrying equipment far more sophisticated than required for conventional wildlife studies. I maintained my role as the helpful but slightly eccentric resident biologist, guiding them to areas far from the valley while feeding them believable but misleading data. Bear activity tends to concentrate in the western quadrant, I'd tell them, knowing Silverback's territory lay to the east. They'd nod, make notes, but I could sense their skepticism. They were hunting something specific, and they suspected I knew more than I was sharing. One morning in September 2005, I found Silverback waiting at our usual meeting place, his massive body tense, eyes alert. He made an urgent sound I'd never heard before and began moving quickly through the forest. I followed, struggling to keep pace as he led me deeper into the mountains than we'd ever gone together. After an hour of difficult hiking, we reached a small clearing. What I saw there froze the blood in my veins. On the forest floor lay the remains of a Bigfoot, smaller than Silverback, with darker fur. The body had been partially dismembered, with precise surgical incisions along the torso and skull. This wasn't the work of predators or natural death. This was methodical, scientific, human. Silverback stood at the edge of the clearing, making a low, mournful sound that seemed to emanate from deep in his chest. I approached the body carefully, examining but not touching. The cuts were clean, made with sharp instruments. Several tissue samples had been extracted. Most disturbing of all, a small metal object was embedded at the base of the skull, some kind of tracking device now inactive. When I looked up, Silverback was performing a series of deliberate gestures, pointing to his eyes, then to the body, then making a gun shape with his fingers, followed by motions that mimicked writing or recording. He was telling me a story. Someone had been tracking this individual, had hunted it, had taken samples. This wasn't random, it was systematic. Back at my cabin, I began searching through years of accumulated research papers and government bulletins, looking for anything that might explain what I'd seen. Hidden in a routine Forest Service memorandum from 2002, I found a reference to Project Primeval, a Department of Defense initiative for biological asset identification and potential utilization of unclassified North American primate species. The pieces began fitting together: the surveillance, the census team, the helicopters. This wasn't about protection or conservation. This was about exploitation of a species the government officially denied existed. Through careful observation over the following months, I identified 3 surveillance devices hidden around the perimeter of my research area. Small, weatherproof cameras with satellite uplink capabilities. Technology far beyond standard wildlife monitoring equipment. I left them untouched, but began feeding them false patterns, deliberately appearing on camera in locations away from silverback's territory, creating a diversion. By 2007, I noticed alarming changes in the behavior of the juvenile, now a young adult male standing nearly 8 feet tall. While Silverback, his mate, and the other adult male remained cautious and deliberate in their movements, the younger one displayed increasing agitation. He would stand at the edge of the forest for hours, watching the distant roads. He began making aggressive displays toward me, something the others had never done. During one encounter in early spring, he approached to within 10 feet, beating his chest and vocalizing loudly enough that birds scattered from nearby trees. Silverback intervened, placing himself between us and making sharp, reprimanding sounds. The younger male retreated, but the tension remained. Something was changing in the fragile trust I'd built with this family. In November 2008, I returned from a supply run to find my cabin had been searched. Nothing was missing, but my equipment had been moved, my journals examined. They'd been careful, but I'd become attuned to the slightest changes in my environment after years in the wilderness. That night, I created a hidden compartment beneath my floorboards, secreting away the most sensitive documentation of my work with the Bigfoot family. The intrusions continued, subtle but unmistakable. Twice, I spotted men in unmarked tactical gear moving through the forest at night, using infrared equipment. I began sleeping with my cabin windows blacked out to prevent thermal imaging from revealing my movements. The pressure reached a breaking point in summer 2010 when I discovered fresh tranquilizer darts embedded in trees near the valley. Someone had attempted to capture one of the creatures. I searched frantically but found no signs of injury or capture among the family. They had retreated deeper into the cave system, emerging only at night for the next 2 weeks. When Silverback finally returned to our meeting place, he brought something clutched in his massive hand. A small metal case containing syringes, vials of clear liquid, and a document stamped Specimen Acquisition Protocol. He'd recovered it from whoever had attempted the capture. The document detailed methods for sedating, containing, and transporting subjects, with specific warnings about dosage based on estimated body weight. My position at the research station was becoming increasingly untenable. Dr. Richards called more frequently, questioning discrepancies in my reports. The surveillance team rotated new personnel into the area every few months, and most concerning of all, the young male Bigfoot was showing signs of unpredictable behavior, breaking established territorial patterns, vocalizing loudly at night, and once destroying a motion sensor camera he'd discovered. In late 2012, Silverback led me to a confrontation I'll never forget. We came across 3 men in tactical gear attempting to set up a trap using food laced with sedatives. From our hidden vantage point, I watched in horror as the youngest member of the Bigfoot family approached the bait from the opposite side. Before I could intervene, Silverback burst from cover with surprising speed, overturning the trap and confronting the men with a display of strength that bent metal equipment like tissue paper. The men fled, dropping their weapons in panic. It was the first time I had witnessed the full physical capability of these creatures. Silverback could have killed those men with minimal effort. Instead, he had chosen to frighten them away. But the incident left me with a chilling realization. The delicate balance I'd helped maintain for nearly a quarter-century was unraveling, and when it finally broke, someone would die. My forced retirement came in January 2013, delivered with bureaucratic precision in a letter citing budget cuts and reorganization of research priorities. Dr. Richards at least had the courtesy to call me personally. "James, we both know this isn't about budgets," she said, her voice crackling over the satellite phone. "Whatever you're doing up there, whatever you're hiding, people are noticing. You've made powerful enemies. Take the retirement package and walk away clean." I had no intention of walking away. By February, I had moved to a small cabin in Forks, 38 miles from my research station but close enough to maintain contact with Silverback's family. I continued my visits, no longer constrained by official reports or scheduled check-ins. My research became entirely focused on protecting the creatures from the shadow operation I now knew was hunting them. The younger male, whom I'd begun calling Rusty for the reddish tint in his otherwise dark fur, had grown increasingly unpredictable. Now, standing a full 9 feet tall with shoulders measuring nearly 4 feet across, he had developed into a formidable presence. While the Silverback had always maintained a gentle demeanor despite his massive size, Rusty displayed frequent aggressive behaviors, uprooting small trees, hurling rocks with enough force to shatter against cliff faces, and making territorial displays that echoed through the valleys. More concerning were the signs of conflict within the family itself. During a visit in April 2014, I discovered a clearing where a violent confrontation had obviously occurred. Trees were broken at the 7-foot mark, deep gouges scarred the earth, and tufts of both silver-streaked and reddish fur clung to splintered branches. Silverback and Rusty had fought violently. When Silverback finally appeared 2 days later, he moved with a noticeable limp, a deep wound on his left shoulder partially healed. He approached me with urgency, his gestures conveying distress. Through our rudimentary communication, he showed me that Rusty had challenged him repeatedly, had become unpredictable, had twice threatened the female. The social structure was fracturing. What I observed over the next several months suggested something beyond normal territorial disputes or maturation behaviors. Rusty would disappear for weeks, then return more agitated than before. He began raiding human campsites, something the family had always carefully avoided, stealing not just food but objects, backpacks, clothing, metal implements. He collected these items in a separate cave, arranging them in disturbing patterns I couldn't decipher. In early 2016, I found evidence that Rusty had killed and partially consumed a black bear, unusual behavior for the typically herbivorous and occasionally fish-eating Bigfoot. The carcass displayed signs of unnecessary violence, with limbs wrenched from sockets and the skull crushed with excessive force. This wasn't predation for sustenance, it was rage expressed through killing. I began to suspect something physiological was affecting Rusty's behavior. During a careful examination of the family's water sources, I discovered disturbing evidence. Upstream from their primary drinking pool, concealed beneath a natural rock formation, sat a small mechanical device releasing measured amounts of clear liquid into the water. I collected samples and, calling in favors from a former colleague who asked no questions, had it analyzed. The results confirmed my worst fears: a synthetic compound related to testosterone and cortisol, designed to increase aggression and territorial behavior. Someone was deliberately attempting to weaponize these creatures, or at least study their potential for aggression. And Rusty, drinking more than the others due to his larger size and higher metabolism, had received the highest dose. By 2018, the situation had deteriorated further. Silverback's mate and the other adult male had retreated deeper into the mountain range, rarely appearing. Silverback himself seemed torn between staying in his traditional territory and following them, his loyalty to his established home competing with his instinct to protect his family. During one of our increasingly rare meetings, Silverback communicated something that chilled me. Rusty had attacked his own mother, injuring her severely before Silverback could intervene. The family unit was now completely fractured. Rusty had claimed the valley and nearby caves as his exclusive territory, driving out the others through increasingly violent confrontations. The government teams had noticed the change as well. Their activities intensified, with new equipment arriving on heavy trucks, including large cage-like structures with reinforced steel bars and hydraulic mechanisms. They were preparing for a capture operation, and based on the size of the containment units, they were targeting Rusty. In September 2020, I was followed for the first time, not by government agents but by a private security team in unmarked vehicles. They tracked me from Forks to the forest edge, made no attempt to hide their surveillance. A clear message: we know who you are, what you know, and where you go. 2 weeks later, my cabin was broken into while I was visiting the forest. My journals were photographed but left in place. Another message. They wanted me to know they had access to everything. The implied threat was clear: walk away or face consequences. I should have listened. Instead, I made the catastrophic mistake that would cost lives. Believing I needed to warn Silverback and help relocate any remaining family members before the capture operation launched, I made an unplanned visit at dusk. In my haste, I failed to spot the tracking device magnetically attached to my vehicle's undercarriage. I led them straight to the heart of Bigfoot territory. As night fell, I heard the distant sound of the helicopters approaching. Flashlight beams cut through the trees as teams deployed in tactical formation. I ran deeper into the forest, desperate to find Silverback before they did. What I didn't realize was that someone else had found me first. A massive shadow detached from the darkness behind me, moving with terrible purpose. Rusty had been watching, and now he was hunting. The dawn of October 17th, 2021 broke with the soft pattering of rain on fallen leaves. I had spent the night in a hollow beneath a massive cedar, my clothes soaked through, body trembling with cold and fear. The sounds of the search teams had faded around midnight. Their operations presumably paused until daylight. But I knew they would return. The machinery I'd glimpsed through the trees, transport cages, tracking equipment, tranquilizer rifles, told me this wasn't a simple reconnaissance mission. They were here to capture or kill. As the gray light filtered through the canopy, I began moving carefully toward the limestone caves where Silverback had last established his territory. The forest felt wrong. Too quiet, disturbed in ways only someone who had spent decades here would notice. Broken branches hung at odd angles. Depressions in the soft earth revealed where heavy equipment had been dragged. Most telling were the abandoned campsites I passed. Food left uneaten. Equipment scattered. The search teams had fled something during the night. The first blood trail appeared about 2 miles into my journey, dark splashes against green moss, leading away from a crushed satellite phone and torn backpack. Government issue based on the markings. I followed cautiously, my hiking staff gripped tightly, though I knew it would provide no real protection if needed. The trail led to a small clearing where the violence had unfolded. 2 men in tactical gear lay motionless, their bodies broken in ways that spoke of overwhelming force. One had been thrown against a tree with such power that the trunk had cracked, the impact crushing his ribcage. The other lay face down, his head twisted at an impossible angle. These weren't random kills, they were executions performed with terrible efficiency. I continued on, following a new trail, larger footprints now, over 18 inches long, pressing deep into the soil. Rusty's prints. He was moving purposefully, heading toward the eastern ridge where the family had originally lived. I followed at a safe distance, stopping frequently to listen, to watch. The rain intensified, dripping from the canopy in fat, cold drops that soaked through my already damp clothes. Near a stream crossing, I found Silverback. He was crouched beside a fallen log, bleeding from multiple wounds across his massive shoulders and back. Not bullet wounds, these were deep gashes made by powerful claws. He had fought Rusty again and barely escaped. When he saw me, he made a low, mournful sound that seemed to carry the weight of decades. I approached slowly, showing my empty hands. "I'm sorry," I whispered. "I never meant for any of this to happen." Silverback rose to his full height, now showing signs of age I hadn't fully acknowledged before. Silver fur now more white than gray, movements slightly stiffened, eyes clouded with cataracts. Still, he stood nearly 9 feet tall, a giant from another age. He made a series of quick gestures, pointing toward the eastern ridge, then making a slashing motion across his throat. A warning. Danger. "Rusty?" I asked, though I knew the answer. Silverback confirmed with a short grunt, then did something unprecedented. He reached out and grasped my shoulder, his massive hand engulfing my upper arm. The touch was gentle but insistent. He was leading me away from the ridge, toward the west, toward safety. But I couldn't leave, not without understanding what had happened, not without seeing if anything could be salvaged from this tragedy. "I need to find him," I said, pulling away. "Maybe I can help. Maybe there's a way to reverse what they've done to him." Silverback's eyes, those deep, intelligent eyes that had watched me age from young scientist to gray-haired old man, held something I'd never seen before. Resignation. He released my arm and stepped back, making one final gesture, a hand across his heart, and then extended toward me. "Goodbye." I watched him disappear into the forest, moving west, away from the conflict, away from the territory he had defended for decades. I never saw him again. The eastern ridge loomed before me, a wall of rock and ancient trees shrouded in mist. I climbed carefully, following signs of recent passage. Broken branches, disturbed earth, more blood. Human blood. At the summit, I found what remained of the captured team's base camp. 5 transport vehicles lay on their sides, tossed like toys. Equipment worth millions scattered and broken. More bodies, 7 in total, their deaths quick but brutal. And in the center of the destruction stood the cave entrance, its mouth dark against the gray stone of the ridge. Something moved in that darkness. Something massive, breathing heavily. I could smell the metallic tang of blood mixed with a musky animal scent I'd known for 33 years. "Rusty," I called softly, using the name he'd never heard me speak. "It's me." He emerged slowly, ducking his massive frame under the cave entrance. In the diffuse morning light, I could see how much he'd changed. His fur was patchy, falling out in clumps to reveal skin covered in lesions and scars. His eyes were bloodshot. The pupils contracted to pinpoints despite the dim light. Foam flecked the corners of his mouth. Whatever chemical they had introduced to the water supply had done more than increase aggression. It had induced a neurological breakdown, a form of madness. Rusty straightened to his full height, nearly 10 feet tall, his massive arms hanging at his sides, hands curled into fists that could crush rock. Blood coated his chest and forearms, some of it still wet. He tilted his head, studying me with eyes that held no recognition, no memory of the decades of peaceful interaction, no trace of the curious juvenile I had watched grow up. "I'm sorry," I said again, though I knew words meant nothing now. "I should have protected you better." For a moment, something flickered in those ravaged eyes, a glimmer of the intelligence that had once been there. His head tilted, nostrils flaring as he caught my scent. Recognition, perhaps, or memory. Then it vanished, replaced by rage. He charged with a speed that belied his enormous size, covering the 30 feet between us in less than a second. I didn't run. There was nowhere to go, and running would only trigger predatory instinct. Instead, I stood my ground, arms at my sides showing no threat. The impact came with shocking force. One massive hand closed around my left arm, lifting me off the ground as easily as I might lift a twig. I felt bones shatter, tendons tear. With my right hand, I reached out, touching the side of his face, a gesture Silverback and I had shared countless times over the decades. For one heartbeat, Rusty froze. Something passed between us. Recognition, confusion, perhaps even regret. Then the madness reclaimed him. The last thing I saw was the cave ceiling, rough stone illuminated by the flashlight that had fallen from my pocket. 3 weeks later, a search party found my left arm, severed cleanly at the shoulder, placed deliberately beside my weather-resistant journal at the forest edge. The arm had not been eaten or damaged further. It was a message, though whether one of warning or remorse, no one could say. The journal contained my complete records, 33 years of observation, communication, and coexistence with creatures science insisted couldn't exist. The rest of my body was never recovered. The government denied any involvement in the Olympic National Forest operations, claiming the tactical teams were private researchers acting illegally. The journal disappeared from evidence within days. The cave system was dynamited under the pretense of geological instability. By spring 2022, the entire eastern ridge had been closed to the public indefinitely. But deep in the mountains to the west, beyond the reach of roads and surveillance, beyond the memory of what humans had done, a small family of creatures continues. Sometimes hikers report strange sounds echoing across valleys at dusk, not threatening roars, but soft, mournful calls that fade into the twilight. Some say it sounds almost like grief. In my final journal entry, I wrote words I hope someone someday will read and understand. They were never monsters until we made them so. The tragedy of the Bigfoot isn't that they exist, it's that we exist alongside them, bringing our fear, our greed, our need to control. I gave my life trying to protect them, and in the end, I became what I most feared, the human who brought destruction to their door.